Okay, so thank you for joining us, Professor Douglas Farrow.
My pleasure.
So I'm here with Perry as usual, and we are back discussing current ideas that are still somewhat related to science that we usually discuss. So we're joined by Professor Douglas Farrow. He is a professor of theology and ethics at McGill University, so our alma maters, and he teaches in the School of Religious Studies. His studies include historical and systematic theology, theological anthropology, and ethics, as well as political theology. And if I said anything wrong, do correct me, Professor. Thank you so much. All right. I think we should introduce ourselves a little bit so everyone has sort of our backgrounds in mind. I'll introduce myself. So I'm Carlos. I'm, I guess, computer scientist slash bioinformatics specialization. So I work a lot on problems pertaining to biological systems and how we can solve them with algorithms. And I'll let Perry introduce himself there.
Yeah, so I graduated recently from the physics department at McGill, got my doctorate in condensed matter physics. And yeah, working with Carlos for a while also on blockchain stuff, some bio stuff. So that's generally where we come from. But today, a bit different, venturing into the world of something totally unrelated to what we talked about before.
Yes, so then to the matter at hand, I came across an article that you wrote, Professor, that I found very interesting, and it was shared in my lab, in discussing the topic that everyone's discussing now, which is the COVID pandemic, and specifically the vaccinations and what kind of moral implications come out of that very new problem that nobody has really thought about even considering before. So the article is called Whether There is a Moral Obligation to be Vaccinated, and it was published in Catholic World Report. So if you could just give us a brief introduction about how you came to this issue, what were the main ideas, and what kind of issues we should be thinking about here.
Yes, well, I confess that I came to the issue by the usual sort of professorial distraction method. That is, I was working on other things, and a colleague from New York called me up and said, this was back in March of 2020, and said, you wouldn't believe this sort of palpable fear on the streets in this city. Where are the theologians? Why aren't they speaking to this? And I said, well, right, I'll try to get up to speed and think about what I might say. So a year and a half later, I have spent inordinate amounts of time on this crisis, thinking about all sorts of different aspects of it, some of which are well beyond my expertise, as theology may be beyond yours. But in a context like this, we need not only to talk to each other, but to think across disciplines and think together about difficult questions. I was struck when the chief medical health officer of, I believe it was Nova Scotia, admitted not too long ago that the lockdowns were as much to keep people from talking to each other as from transmitting the virus. So apparently there is some palpable fear even amongst the authorities that misinformation might leak out more widely than the virus itself. Let's hope we're not contributing to that by trying to think together about this.
Yeah, sounds fair. Actually, maybe if we back up a little bit, since you brought up theology, one of your listed interests is political theology, and I thought maybe that's an interesting way to start the discussion. Is this an instance where political theology needs to be worked on, and what kind of relationship is there between politics and theology nowadays?
Well, the last of those questions is a difficult one to answer, but basically political theology is a kind of thinking about politics on the one hand and theology on the other that takes into account questions of authority and the justification of authority, and does so on what I would call a realist basis rather than a positivist basis. That is, the idea being that law and social order and so forth don't arise simply out of what people say is the case or wish to be the case, but that they have a foundation in something beyond themselves. And once you start thinking about that, whether you're Aristotle or Aquinas or a decadent postmodern like ourselves, you're going to have to do some theology along the way. I came to that because I studied Christian doctrines of the authority of Jesus. And it was necessary and natural to extend that, just as Jews do with Moses, into other spheres of and other disciplines. So political theology was for me something I really had to get engaged with. But anybody who's thinking hard about what is authority and where does it reside is going ultimately to have to think about these larger questions that theology always thinks about.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it sort of comes to something we were talking about before this chat, like whether there's, at the end of the day, we have to come up with some basic assumptions about, how we should order our societies that end up in faith, I would say, and that we should somehow treat those as immutable truths, and from there try to address things, because we can always try to say, well, maybe this is one of our first questions relating to the article, which is, how much of the objections that have been raised on the moral sphere depend on the apparent risk that the pandemic is sort of manifesting itself in. Like, if the virus were 10 times more deadly or 10 times more contagious, would we still condone a lot of these things that maybe in your article you say you don't condone?
Well, we will need to talk about that, because of course, all human decisions in the political and social and the whole sphere of practical life require, if they are to be good decisions, a proper exercise of the virtue of prudence. And of course, that requires taking account of actual circumstances. So if we were facing something as serious as the Spanish flu or smallpox, or God forbid, the Black Death, we're talking about something orders of magnitude more serious than the current coronavirus crisis. And prudence would, of course, dictate other concerns, taking certain kinds of decisions about appropriate actions under those circumstances. So the principles would remain the same, but the application of the principles would certainly differ if we were in such a situation. But we're not, and anybody who's paying any attention at all to the facts on the ground knows that we're not. Lots of people, I'm afraid, pay attention only to CTV and CBC and CNN and that sort of thing, and they may not know very much. But anyone who's paying attention to the data we do have knows that we're not in that situation. So prudence is going to function differently as it addresses this situation than it would if it had addressed those. I mean, likewise in political theory itself, the famous and rather problematic German political theorist Carl Schmitt, made the case that authority ultimately is grounded not in law, but the laws themselves and the very capacity to make laws is the ground of that is exposed during what he called the state of exception. When you suspend normal laws, you find out who really has the authority, and real authority is works through the power to suspend constitutions and laws. Well, we've arguably been in a situation for a year and a half now where many ordinary laws and constitutional principles have been abandoned. I remember seeing a video of an officer on the street confronted by a woman this was in Canada, wearing a T-shirt with section 1, 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms printed on the T-shirt. And the policeman lectured her when she asked about her rights, saying that the decision of the local health officer trumps section 1 and 2 of the Constitution. And I was sitting there thinking, geez, I don't think that's got to the Supreme Court yet. How does that officer know? and on what basis is he ordering the woman around in terms of his understanding of this state of exception? I mean, he doesn't know Carl Schmitt, and he doesn't know even Canadian law other than what his boss back at the precinct tells him to do. But anyways, in a state like this, we do have to wrestle with questions of where authority comes from, what it is grounded in. And if we can maintain a state of exception, those answers expose themselves in new and different ways. And my sense of this is that we have artificially created and certainly artificially maintained a state of exception we don't need, allowing many authorities to act beyond their proper authority. So there's sort of the big picture. Yeah. I'm
wondering, maybe we can go through the article and we can get to concrete points you've made within them, just to get a base of what to orient the discussion, and then we can attack each point, because I think the article is very well written in the sense of objections and counterpoints. So we can go through them one by one and then get to these nitty-gritty details.
Great, and let me just say that the article, of course, comes from the 9th of April of this year, in, as you say, Catholic World Report, and I'm grateful for you drawing people's attention to it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, we should keep in mind that maybe there are some new facts that could update some of these arguments. I don't know if you think that's still the case, Professor.
Well, there are always new facts appearing. I haven't seen anything that would cause me to rethink the application of the principles. But in fact, some of the new facts seem to bear out what I was saying, as far as I can tell. But sure, let's go to that if you like.
Maybe before we can, I don't know, Carlos, do you want to say a disclaimer a bit, or?
Okay, I mean, yeah, I should. I was thinking I forgot to do that, but maybe if for anyone listening, I think we should say that the goal of this discussion is purely to wrestle with moral questions, and sometimes they might be, we might come up with theoretical situations or whatever, but at the end of the day, none of us are medical experts, and this is really not meant to guide anyone's actions other than make them think about what's going on in the world. So I think maybe that's fair to say.
Indeed.
And yeah, so I think we can go to the article. I don't know if you think it's a good idea to share the screen. We usually do that. What do you think, Perry? Should we share the screen?
I think that'd be a good idea. We can point things out.
Yeah, because I think the structure lends itself to going through it independently one by one. So just give me a second.
Yeah, I must say, I think both of us agree that we really enjoyed the structure of the article. It was the points were clearly laid out, and the counterpoints as well. So I think it's very easy now to go through it and discuss individual points.
Yes, I like that. Okay, so everyone sees the article, right?
I do. Yep.
So the first point I think was when I read it, I was like, how are you going to argue against that? Because it says any person who has the power to prevent his neighbor's danger or loss is obliged to do so. It comes from, I don't know the specific writer, Victoria, but maybe you can expand on that, Professor. And, to me, that seemed like a pretty basic, almost intuitive thing to say. But if you can take us through what is the objection for that?
Can I just maybe before that ask a quick pre-question? I think we were both wondering, this article is written, I guess, for Catholics maybe, but hopefully it also lends itself to other non-Catholics, basically?
Yes. I'll comment on that first. Of course, if writing in something like the Catholic World Report, one's primary audience is the what I think nearly 2 billion Catholics of some description. Not that they all read it, and not that many of them would wade through an article like this, but yes, Catholics are the first, the first audience. But of course, moral thinking in the Catholic tradition, as a development of, and also in some respects, an alternative to the moral thinking in the Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle and others, is something that on which our civilization has basically been built. And our civilization has always included many who were neither Christian, generally speaking, nor Catholic in particular. And the kind of thinking I'm doing here is thinking I do intend for others besides Catholic, although there are elements in it that only Catholics would quickly recognize or know what to do with without a fair bit of further work. That said, the average Catholic doesn't work very hard at being Catholic. So people who aren't Catholic are in lots of company there, whether we want to call it good or bad company. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, the axioms are based on the Catholic religion, maybe, but they apply to all people that are Western thinkers, say maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe West.
That's a little trickier, because of course the Catholic worldview is one that is grounded in the Nicene or ecumenical creed, the first part of which deals with the notion of God as creator. And so the Catholic approach to religion is not like perhaps the Supreme Court of Canada's approach or various Protestant theorists of religion, such as those court views tend to be based on. It's a view that is not subjectivist. It doesn't regard religion as extra rational, that is beyond rationality, much less as irrational. It understands not only moral obligations, but all the major dimensions of our reading of reality to be reality dependent. And so the notion that well, that's fine for you as a Catholic, or that's fine for you as a Buddhist, but it doesn't touch other people, represents a view of religion to which Catholics, if they're thinking like Catholics, don't actually hold. And in morality, this probably has the most bite, because morality is understood as a capacity to voluntarily live out and affirm the design of creation, and to conform to it in constructive ways, and to do good and constructive things with it. But the underlying reality would be common on that view for everyone, not merely for theists, but also for atheists, not merely for Christians, but also for Jews, etc. So I don't know if that helps. And if you want to press me a bit on that, I'm happy to elaborate.
Sorry, that I think that helps. Yeah.
I want maybe a follow-up on that. Like, do you see that? I think maybe a lot of the sort of reactions that people are experiencing today, who maybe don't feel comfortable with a lot of the way governments have reacted to COVID, come from maybe some sort of instinctive instinctual like defensiveness of what we might call like Enlightenment values. So, basic individual liberties and, your right to, displacement and right to work and right to determine your own medication and things like that. Do you think that those kinds of values, should we say, have a certain commonality in the Catholic perspective as well?
Yes, I would say they do. In the Catholic world, there's also a kind of instinctual respect for authority, which is also doctrinal. It's not just instinctual, because the order given to creation by the Creator is of course subject to the Creator himself, and part of the design is that humans as social animals should operate according to ordained authority. That authority is a good and useful form of human interaction. So I've forgotten to come back to Vittoria. I will, but let's go back behind him to Augustine, who could say, in the Catholic Church, there's nothing more wholesome than having authority precede argument. And I point out to my students, this is not a way of saying you don't argue, obey. It's a way of saying that sound argument does rest on some form of authority, just like sound social functioning always involves some form of authority. And if ultimately you're appealing to the goodness of God and the authority of God, you're probably on a sounder footing for conducting the argument you mean to have than if you're ignoring that. So built into the whole worldview is a sense of authority has its rightful and proper place. And so the presumption ought to be one of respect for, and even as far as possible, trust in authority. Now, that doesn't change the fact that unless we're talking about God, authority is corruptible. And even as we commonly say, the corruption of the best is the worst. The higher the authority that is corrupted, the more dangerous it is. So at that point, these sort of libertarians' ideals of individual autonomy and the Catholic ideals of appropriately ordered freedom do in fact coincide. And it's interesting in this current crisis to see people from those quarters, quite different quarters, converging on the notion that there's some stuff going on here which is really unhelpful and not right, and suggests that there's a reason not to trust the very authorities in whom we should ordinarily be able to trust and would ordinarily think we ought to trust.
Just to clarify for myself, you're suggesting that in the context where authorities are corrupted, the values of the libertarians align with the values of the Catholics.
I'm saying I've noticed that a lot of the hard questions that are being put and the resistance to certain coercive mandates cross those boundaries. Libertarianism is not, of course, a religion in the same sense as Catholicism is, and it's nowhere near as large. And it's also very different in many of its presuppositions. But in what we might broadly call libertarian circles, there is a certain tendency here in this crisis to do what they also do in other spheres, and that is say, well, wait a minute, we don't believe this just because you tell us, and we're not going to do it just because you tell us to do it. We're going to think for ourselves. And there, the notion that the human being is a rational animal and a social animal, yes, but one whose society is voluntary in many important respects, as well as necessary in other respects, and that must cultivate a habit of healthy questioning. That I do think is in common, and it's interesting to me that some of the most effective questioning of authorities in the current situation has come from circles that are quite different in their actual daily instincts and different in their worldview even, but who at least share that in common. Let me just answer while you ponder that briefly the question as to who Vittoria was. Vittoria was, along with Bishop Las Casas, the main spokesperson for the indigenous peoples of Latin and South America when they were being overrun by European imperialists out for gold and gain, and who were subjecting them to slavery, even claiming that they were, somehow subhuman and therefore didn't have ordinary human rights, which Europe, under the influence of Christianity, had already developed pretty sophisticated ideas about. And Vittoria was, as I say, one of the two great champions in the European intellectual world who worked on both sides of the, like Las Casas, on both sides of the pond, so to say. And tried to articulate not only how justice should be playing out here, but what prudence is and so forth. So that's who he is. Very interesting, very influential person in the development of theories about war, just war, and various other political questions that are also moral questions.
Was he a member of the church?
Yes, he was. Yes, yeah, yes, he was. He was a well-known theologian, and I don't. He was doing this very consciously on a Catholic foundation.
Very, very. Yeah. Thanks for that introduction on where this article fits in in the moral landscape, I guess. But maybe we can get to the points now. Sorry, I sort of derailed us from Carlos's initial question.
No, it's good. I think it sets a very nice background. So I'm happy you did that, Perry.
Oh, you're welcome then.
Yeah, so I guess the article is structured according to 6 statements, right? Which you call objections. And my first question was, I'm not used to this kind of format, but when you say objection, do you mean an objection to a specific statement? Like that there is a moral obligation or not moral obligation to be vaccinated?
Yeah, so let me explain that very simply. The technique is that of the disputatio or disputation that was common in the universities from the very outset. Universities as we know them developed in the 12th century out of the schools that were created in or adjacent to cathedrals and monasteries. And as these people tried to both revive classical learning and Christianize it, they developed a very sophisticated method of argumentation. And you're seeing here my attempt to imitate that. If you were to read Thomas Aquinas for yourself, you would see that his major works are structured in just this way. And it's not as difficult to follow as some imagine, who haven't actually tried, because the question or the thesis, usually a question, is stated at the outset. So then is given a set. It could be just a couple, or it could be a dozen objections to the claim, or they may be objections to the denial of the claim. That varies according to the article in question. So in this case, whether there is a moral obligation to be vaccinated, the objections are to, if you like, are to a negation of that statement. So if I believe that there is not a moral obligation to be vaccinated, and I'm going to, in this case, that is in the case we're dealing with, I'm not talking generically, but in this case, I am going to defend the idea that there is no moral obligation to be vaccinated during this coronavirus crisis, as we so far know it. So the objections are objecting to that position, and there are 6 that I give, which summarize the case as best I know how. And then what follows in this way is an authority is appealed to. So that's the sed contra. On the contrary, and you could appeal to Aristotle, or you could appeal to Moses, or you could appeal to Jesus, or whatever. And then your own position is stated in the respondeo, or I answer that. And after that, you then have to go back and reply to your opponent's views. So when you want to read this form of argumentation, whether it's in Aquinas or here in this article, if you like, you can start at the center in the I answer that. You get a straightforward statement of the position, and then you can work forwards and backwards by going through the objections at the outset and the responses or replies to the objections that follow. Fairly simple, not as complicated as blockchain, I'm sure.
Almost.
Almost. I mean, I didn't know I had to start in the middle, so that's a new one.
Well, you don't, of course, have to start in the middle, but if, like many students, you're in a bit of a hurry and you want to make sure that you have the main points in front of you as you read the rest, it's not cheating to start in the middle and then go to the objections and maybe think about, well, if I held the position stated in the middle, if I answered the same way, and I were confronted with these objections, how would I respond? Or have the objections overlooked something very, very important that would be difficult to respond to? So I would want to change then the position. It's a really useful tool for helping people to think clearly.
Yeah, and it seems not that common nowadays, which is one of the reasons I said it was refreshing, that they, I mean, I would maybe ignorantly call this some sort of steelman setup, right? Where you try to make your opponent's position as strong as possible so that your response is also as strong as possible. Yes,
no, that's quite right, quite right. Because if you're pursuing truth and not just power, you should care about that.
Yeah, I think it's being open to the idea that you might learn something from the opponent, and you might not have a complete picture of things. So
yes, and you will find people who are good at this. They can often create better arguments on behalf of their opponents than their opponents themselves have generated.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I hadn't seen it stated so succinctly. If we go to the first objection, that you're obliged to care, if you have the capacity to do so, to reduce the harm to others that you may, impose on them. So I was, when I read that, like I said, surprised to see, looking forward to seeing how you can argue against that, and maybe you can give us a quick summary of, where the rebuttal comes there.
Yes. So
maybe, sorry, even before the rebuttal, this I would say is almost axiomatic, maybe to some degree.
Yes.
Like, right. So there's some axiom that says we should prevent.
I mean, it's the golden rule, no? Treat others as you would have them
Sure.
treat you, no?
But yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yes.
But,
So that's right. You want to work with principles and that are well established. And so the objection, the first objection, works with that in Christianity, at least, well-established principle. But there are forms of the golden rule, if you like, somewhat weaker forms, but forms found in many civilizations and religions. And so it's working with a well-established principle, made even perhaps a bit more robust by appeal to specific biblical teaching, and then drawing the conclusion from it that one ought to get vaccinated. As so, the objection, the reply to this first objection, objection 1, is of course not going to attack the principle, but attack the link between the principle or premise and the conclusion. So any sound argumentation, if you don't agree your premises, you can't argue together. You
Right.
can argue about the premises, but you can't proceed with the argument itself. If you agree the premises, then if it's a simple, straightforward syllogism, if you agree both premises, you don't get to argue about the conclusion, because the conclusion follows necessarily from those two premises. But few arguments can be reduced to a single syllogism, so you might have to argue about a whole series of syllogisms. How do you move from the principle stated to the conclusion offered that one should be vaccinated in this situation? That's where, so to say, the devil is in the details, and the reply in this case is fairly brief, saying that it fails in the following ways. You can't get from that sound premise to this conclusion without making some mistakes.
So just to try and simplify the objection for myself in a very colloquial way, can I say, if the virus is a danger to everyone, I can expect that somebody will want for me to be vaccinated before I interact with them. That's it's sort of trying to apply the golden rule in that setting, right?
Sure. And of course,
sorry. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, well, I was just going to say, in probing that, one has to ask whether the vaccination is something that is in itself harmless and generally helpful. And so we are told constantly that these vaccinations are safe and effective. But that, of course, is seriously disputed, not only by some people without a great deal of knowledge about it, but by some people with a great deal of knowledge about it. And so I make the claim here that if the process of the vaccination contains serious risks, it's unethical to vaccinate people who are not themselves at serious risk.
So I have the premise we're starting with, though, is that we should, maybe that not other people want us to get vaccinated, but we should want ourselves to be vaccinated to help others, I guess.
Yes, good point. And of course, if it could be shown that what is claimed is true, that the vaccines are safe and effective, it probably wouldn't be necessary to go much further than we've already gone with the first objection, yes? The reply to the objection would look different, and it might be that the position itself would be different. If I say to you, here's a candy bar, I can tell you this from actual experience. You're in a canoe with someone on a river. They have an insulin problem. They're about to faint. You're a long way from help, but you have a candy bar. This is going to help them. Give it to them. That's pretty much a no-brainer. Now, we paddled a very long way and very hard to try to get the person to more serious help. But it's pretty much a no-brainer. The problem is, if the candy bar itself is not harmless, well, candy bars aren't generally harmless, but in that situation, the good so outweighs the harm, you don't think about it. But is that the case here? We're being told that it is by some people in authority. We're being told that it is by a lot of people who are making a lot of money off of it. But there's plenty of evidence to question those claims. I won't here try to go further than that, because to go further, I would have to demonstrate things that in this forum I'm not going to be able to do. But there's plenty of evidence at the very least to question it, and people are questioning it. And I think that's also the gist of the reply to objection 1. Now, we will have to talk more about those risks, obviously, to make sense of this. And I do talk more about them in the article, although some of my other articles have gone a lot further in trying to explain that.
But so would you say there is a line, though? Say, if could we quantify the amount of risk that would be acceptable, given the I guess the risk of not taking the vaccine, say? So is there is there a proportion of badness of COVID versus potential badness of the vaccine that you would be willing to say, okay, now this objection is no longer valid, say?
Yes. If, for example, if you have, as I said, a relatively safe and relatively effective vaccine, and you are in a situation where you're dealing with a really serious threat, by that I mean a threat that is not only often fatal in its effects, but that also creates enormous harm to people, even people who don't die. So my father, for example, got polio when I was just a baby. And one of my uncles, at risk to himself, drove my father to hospital. My father survived with a certain amount of damage, not too much, thankfully. And my uncle didn't get polio and didn't get any damage. But if you're in a situation with a serious disease like that, and you take some risks you wouldn't ordinarily take, yes. So even if the vaccine were not known to be perfectly safe, you might very well say this is the right thing to do. One of the difficulties here, of course, is that, well, there are at least two difficulties here. One is the question of the seriousness of the challenge of COVID, because, as I said, there are orders of magnitude different in their respective effects. You go right. I'll come to the second difference in a moment, but just to deal with that one very quickly, you go right back to the Diamond Princess, the cruise ship, where you had a kind of crucible for this in the very at the very point that it broke into consciousness in the West. So in the early period of COVID, and those stats have evolved a little bit, generally in the direction of being less serious, but But, at that time, you have ideal circumstances for circulation of the virus on this ship. 712 people out of 3,711 people became infected. So that's an infection rate of 19%. Case fatality rate for those who actually became symptomatic, 1.9%. And there you're dealing with a generally older population. So we know that the average person who has died, let's say with COVID, because it's not always clear whether it's with or from, is 85 in our country. The very time when they die from a seasonal flu, et cetera, et cetera. We know that very young children, children under 20, the CDC itself was telling us in September of last year, 0.003% fatality rate. I mean, we are orders of magnitude different from the situations that we look at historically. So that's the first point, and I could develop that with more data if you like. But people who look into, I looked it up again just a week or two ago. Death rate in Canada per 100,000 people, 0.
Yeah.
0.
So maybe.
Now,
oh, sorry. Go on. Let me finish that.
Just to quickly make the second point. Here we are not dealing, as you know, we are not dealing with what we ordinarily call a vaccine. That is, with a weakened or inert sample of the virus itself, which your body can easily overcome and learn then how to overcome it when it encounters it in more virile form. We're dealing with experimental mRNA treatments, which try to teach your body to do things that your body doesn't ordinarily do. This stuff has been developed for a while, but it has not been tested in neither its short-term nor its long-term effects have been anything like adequately tested. Well, the long-term effects can't be because this is too new. So it's experimental. And we are seeing great numbers of people suffering from this and even dying. So the reports in America are just alarmingly high. More than 12,000 reported deaths within a very short time after vaccination, which is almost certainly, a fraction of what's actually happening. I was talking to a doctor just the other day who said that in that doctor's hospital, people are coming in with serious injuries that appear to be related to their vaccination. And even the referring doctors are putting vaccine injury as a reason. And when they get to the hospital, it's being changed. So it's not, and people aren't asking whether it's related to the vaccine or not. So, anyways, that's all anecdotal and it doesn't prove anything. It's not, like an argument such as I was making, but you can't make these arguments without taking stock of the context, because prudence always demands that you take stock. So if you're faced with a young person who has 0.003% chance of dying from this, that's not true of all young people, by the way, because there are young people with comorbidities you got to take special care with, right? But the average one. And you're saying, well, let's give them an unknown treatment that might have long-term effects and we know has short-term effects. That point is already made in the reply to objection 1. Hey, wait a minute, there's something potentially wrong with that.
If I can just play devil's advocate for a second now.
Sure.
I can argue that we maybe don't know the long-term effects of COVID either. So yes, it's 0.003% that something bad happens to you today, but just like there might be a higher chance that the vaccine might harm me in, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 2 years from now, COVID as well can have some long-term effects that we just don't know about yet.
Yes. So one of the people who helped develop the mRNA treatments, not for COVID, but the procedure, Malone, he has himself what is normally called long COVID. Like he's had COVID and it's had some negative effects, and it continues to have negative effects. And he, by the way, is not against Robert Malone. That is not against attempting to use this this therapy, which he himself helped to develop in principle in the early going, to treat people who are at high risk of serious COVID effects. But he is against using it to treat people who are not at high risk of serious COVID effects. And the reasons for being against that, of course, are several. One is you're taking a person who, even if they do get COVID, we have no reason at present to think that very many of them will have long-term effects. We do have reason at present to think that they are at risk from both short and long-term adverse reactions to the treatment. So you don't take people who are not known to be at great risk. Of course, we all are at risk of things we don't know about. You know,
So that's what I was getting at, right? Now it seems like there are a bunch of avenues to take with varying probabilities. So I guess if we go back to morals, you know, how are you supposed to judge which? Like, I guess someone might argue, well, you know, the risks are roughly the same maybe for both, so you can take the vaccine and help your neighbor.
Well, yes. So of course that takes us into another stage of the argument, and I'll speak to that very quickly, and we'll see where we go with it. But the first thing I think to say is that
like, sorry, just to be clear, all these probabilities are very low, right? Like the probability, let's say, of something bad happening from COVID, if I'm healthy and young and, you know, in optimal condition, and the probability maybe of something bad happening from the vaccine is maybe very low as well. So I'm just
yes, of course. And so it is nonetheless our practice, and I think a good practice, to say that you don't vaccinate healthy people with a risky vaccine. And again, we're not talking about vaccines, we're talking about something that is, I don't know how better to describe it than a form of gene therapy, but we don't vaccinate people who are not seriously at risk with a risky vaccine. And if we are hoping that the vaccine is not too risky and we get to a couple dozen deaths, we withdraw it from the market. That's always been the way. We are here in America alone. It's harder to get some of these stats in Canada because they're not as free at handing them out. But in America alone, we are at a minimum of 12,000 suspicious deaths. You can't say more than that. There may be 50,000 actual deaths, but let's just say minimum here, 12,000 suspicious deaths. That's more deaths than all prior vaccines put together caused before any of them that even got as high as 25 were pulled from the market. So yes, relatively low in the sense that large numbers of people can take these mRNA vaccines and not drop dead, but relatively high, and not just relatively high by a factor of, 10, 15, 20, 50%. We're talking about hundreds of percent higher for these treatments than for anything we've ever used. And yet we're talking about a virus which is doing it's killing and it's wounding at a rate comparable to a serious seasonal flu, not comparable to polio or smallpox or Spanish flu even, or anything like that. So this threat is orders of magnitude lower, but we are allowing a vaccine threat that is orders of magnitude higher. So anybody who's thinking about that is going to want to ask some pretty hard questions about why we are doing that.
So if I could just summarize the point, basically the issue at hand is we don't know enough about the vaccine. Basically, we are risking people on it. Like if the vaccine was shown to be 100% healthy, objection one would the reply to objection one would break down.
Yes,
Okay.
the reply to objection one would break down if we knew for a fact that this so-called vaccine were entirely safe, even if we didn't know for a fact that it were particularly effective.
Right.
But I should just make this proviso, and that is that we're not talking just about possible harm, all right? We are talking about well-established actual harms plus unknown, not yet established long-term harm on that trajectory, which we are not yet able to follow through in practice. So it's not a matter of, oh, well, this might hurt somebody. We know it's hurting people. And, so that's important to remember in the discussion.
Okay.
So
Go ahead, Chris.
all right, maybe like one other angle of this this objection, if we can take an assumption that the vaccine does reduce the chances of being infected by COVID and it's not terribly, like you said, make you drop dead, can we think of the motivation to take it not just to prevent harm that might come upon your neighbor, but this sort of more societal harm that people often bring up, which is, well, okay, yes, maybe this virus is not, in terms of absolute values, very risky for the average person, but our healthcare system, our social, infrastructures aren't built to tolerate that whatever amount of risk added by the virus, like, with the situation of hospitals overcrowding and people's medical treatments being delayed and all that, aren't direct effects of being infected by the virus, but still cause harm to someone that may have been prevented by taking the vaccine.
Certainly, and we're not thinking very hard if we're not thinking about stuff like that. Absolutely. The difficulty there for the objector to the position that I'm arguing in the article is that it's difficult to make good on the claims because, in point of fact, and by the way, I did some work on this in Quebec just to see vis-a-vis local government claims. In point of fact, we have not seen hospitalizations beyond what we normally see with a bad seasonal flu. Now, we have seen them sometimes in unusual spikes, so that for a moment, 4 or 5 key hospitals in Montreal are overwhelmed, but not in terms of the overall capacity of the system. Just as in New York, in Manhattan and central New York, when the virus first broke there, they built overflows. They were never used. Canada built an overflow, as a sort of central overflow in one province, never used. All the constant refrain from the authorities, we're going to be overwhelmed, we're going to be overwhelmed. Here we are in what they're calling the 4th wave. We've never yet been overwhelmed. Now, so then you turn to the other effects, like, okay, so why aren't we overwhelmed? Well, because we locked down, right? But again, when you study the facts of the lockdowns, a very good case has been made, and I think can be sustained, that the lockdowns are doing far more harm to not only the economy, but to people than COVID is doing. So once again, you asked, okay, so yes, you want to look at these other features of the problem. Absolutely, you must look at them, but you have to ask hard questions there too. I can send you, if you like, some pretty substantive documents on lockdown harms, some of which come from governments themselves, not just from critics of government. And we all know and can see some of them, but the ones that are taking their worst toll on people psychologically and physically, never mind economically, are pretty disheartening to look at, I have to say. So again, one comes back to the question, why are we doing all this? We didn't do it before. We don't have good science to support it, though we're constantly using or abusing the word science. We seem prepared to have enormous amounts of harm done to people and to economies in order to address what is, on the scale of things, a very relatively small problem. Something that only outstrips a serious seasonal flu by a minor amount statistically. So again, why? Why are we doing that?
Any ideas on that? I guess, yeah, why would people sort of have this perception, right?
Well, yes, I do have ideas on it, and some of them are, I think, pretty well founded. Others are somewhat speculative. But right from the outset of the coronavirus crisis, the British, and then following suit, the Canadians and some others, put together teams of specialists. And if you like, I can give you the names of some of these teams. Whose task it was to make the people pliable to government policies. And the main device to use, of course, was creating fear in the people, and also, typical manipulative techniques. You seed an idea, but you don't do it, and then later on you create a new level of fear so that you can do what you said you weren't going to do before. This kind of thing is very well described in Laura Dodsworth's book, A State of Fear. And if you want to know some of the units created in the UK to do this, the Research Information Communications Unit, the Rapid Response Unit, the Counter Disinformation Cell, et cetera, you can find all that in her book. But these people were drawn from military intelligence. They were drawn from rapid response units, as I said, and so forth, to try to manipulate public opinion on these things. And those are, whatever one thinks of the manipulation, whatever one says about a particular technique to do with masks or whatever it was, one cannot deny that these units were operating. This was not normal stuff. This was not business as usual. Now, if you ask me why,
I was just going to do that.
Yeah. This is not so easy to prove. This is more speculative. But one thing that immediately comes to mind, speaking of loving your neighbor, is that, of course, there are absolutely vast sums being made on this notion that everybody must be vaccinated, and not only vaccinated once, but twice, and not only twice, but as we see, 3 times and 4 times. Israel, is a month or 2 ahead because of their contract with Pfizer. They're already to the 3rd round. Trudeau himself ordered how many doses for 40 million, less than 40 million Canadians?
Maybe this brings us to one of the other points you make about, I think you made
400 million, 10 times. So, I mean, there are vast sums of money to be made in this business. And
Actually,
there's also just, I'll stop and let you come in with your question. Sorry.
yeah.
But there's also this business about the state of exception.
Mm-hmm.
How long have we preserved a context in which what we said would be okay to do for a couple of weeks to flatten the curve? How long have we maintained that state of exception where ordinary laws and customs and respect for people's liberties does not apply? It's a year and a half now. I have read papers, long papers from international sources asking about what is happening to the law itself in this. And these are not from, you know, people in some obscure fanatical anti-vax place. These are serious legal scholars asking about what is happening to our whole custom and practice of law under this sustained state of exception.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there's an awful lot for people to think about, people like you and me with our very different specializations, but it concerns us all. And there's a lot to think about there. Sorry.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess what I had always told myself or thought would be like maybe the most parsimonious explanation was that actually this is more bottom up. Like people have this fear. Maybe it was, you know, exaggerated by the media, or maybe they actually have that level of, you know, risk aversion naturally. And so governments would be incentivized to respond to that because, you know, they're supposed to respond to their people's desires. And so you might have this sort of snowball effect coming out of that. What do you think of that kind of idea?
Well, I think two things. One, as I was saying a moment ago, we have clear evidence that a lot of the fear was deliberately created by teams working with the government and the media. I'll come back to that because it reminds me of something important. But secondly, that a government's responsibility in a crisis, just like your responsibility in a crisis in your own living quarters. Believe me, I sometimes fail at this, so I understand. I understand the weakness. But a leader's responsibility, whether in a home or in a business or in a university or in the land at large, is, I mean, normally we're complaining about governments not telling us how serious something is so that we don't panic, right? You can't tell them how dire the situation is in England in 1939. You have to say, look, it's really dire and we better be prepared to fight them on the beaches, right? Because you have to encourage people to keep that, you know, stiff upper lip. In this case, it's the other way around. We've heard nothing from the government or the media but nonstop fear for 18 months with occasional let-ups. Of course, again, classical manipulative techniques, right? You beat somebody for a while and then you let up for a bit and then you beat them again and you break them down. Now, we have seen that, the very opposite of what we're used to seeing. So again, questions arise around that, and understandably, legitimately. I'm not saying I know the answers in each case. I'm saying we ought to question that way. Now, here's the other thing I was thinking of that might be interesting to you. Back in 2018, a document was prepared, a roadmap for the European Commission. I'm looking at it as I speak to you, with timelines and deliverables. It's called a roadmap on vaccination. And it covers a period 2018 to 2022. And you can look it up for yourself easily online and examine it. It's complete with language about addressing vaccine hesitancy, and it prescribes getting to vaccination passports by 2022. Now, bear in mind, this document was drafted and approved by the Commission before COVID happened. So when you ask me about motives, I'm not just thinking about Gates and the Gavi people who are making billions upon billions of dollars out of this, and who seem to want it to be a perpetual vaccination system, not two and done, as people were led to believe, but two and then boosters on a regular basis. So as I said, in Israel, they're already to 3 and sometimes 4. Enormous money to be made from that, enormous money. But I'm thinking also of this roadmap to vaccination passports. And what does that mean? It means that previously limited responsibility of citizens to produce identification and reveal information and be generally transparent on all levels to the authorities is going to go out the door as these vaccine passports come in the door. And that's something to which they were working before there was a COVID crisis. That's just simply undeniable. That is in no fashion conspiracy theory. It's there in black and white, approved, laid out as a roadmap. COVID just seems to be very convenient for getting to it according to the timetable. Now, again, you say, well, who's doing that and why? Well, I must leave you to speculate the way I'm speculating. But when I see stuff like that, I don't say, oh, well, these people just haven't read enough Aquinas.
but if we can get back, so
yes, please.
Are you suggesting that not taking the vaccine, or I guess your point of view is not, it's immoral to take the vaccine, but it's not moral because it encourages this type of system where people are profiting off fear of others?
Good question. I think I would say this, that moral action, and because humans are rational animals, their actions in general are moral actions, whether they're moral or immoral. They're not generally amoral. I mean, even giving yourself a good breakfast is a moral action because it's good for your body, right? And if you're a rational animal, you're still an animal, you still need to eat. And so this is a good thing to do, as Aquinas himself would say. So when we look to the needs of ourselves and our neighbors, we have to look, as I say in the article, both at the goods of the body and the goods of the soul. If you don't want to talk about a soul, okay, then just talk about the fact that this is a rational animal and somehow distinct from other animals. I think you need to talk about the soul in the end, but we can leave that aside for now. You're concerned with the
we're okay
goods
with souls.
of the mind.
Good with soul.
We're okay with the soul.
Yeah. Okay, so good. You're concerned with the goods of both the body and the soul, and you maybe can get as far as acknowledging that the soul is a still higher good than the body, although the body itself is good. That's fundamental to the Christian permutation of the Greek tradition, that the body is not just a location where beauty can shine through for a while in some people, but that it's good in itself. This is one of the first struggles that Christianity went through when it was emerging as a major religious and philosophical force and cultural force, to say the body is good in itself. It's not a matter of neglecting the body for the sake of the soul. It's a matter of tending to the body for the good of the soul, which is higher in the hierarchy of goods, right? So when you think like that, and you think about the fact that the human animal is a social animal, you will have to think, yes, that was a very astute question. You will have to think about not just the medical dimensions, but also the social and political dimensions, and whether it's healthy for a society to be fed a diet of fear for 18 months, and whether that is driving people to drug overdoses and suicides and so forth. I mean, many of us who are paying any kind of attention have stories to tell that worry us about people we know who have been waking up in the night with heart pains, not sure whether it's anxiety or whether it's microclotting causing the heart tissue to deteriorate. And I can't answer. But we know people in this situation. We also know many people who are just living in a sense of exhaustion over what will the government demand of me next? What will the chief medical officer come out and say next? And so you have to think about their good on that level too. And if we are to start reacting like this with every analogous situation, it doesn't have to be a probably lab created virus, it can be a perfectly natural virus having similar effects. If we're going to go into all of this stuff we've been for the last year and a half, every time there's an unusual season, a severe seasonal flu, which happens on a cycle of 3 or 4 or 5 years, there's going to be nothing left of our economy, socially, psychologically, spiritually, economically. So yes, we have, if we're going to love the neighbor properly, and I'll say this first to people who take Jesus' summary of the law, that is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the first and greatest commandment. The second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? That's a common Jewish and Christian principle. And as you say, it's also reflected in a weaker form in many other religions. To those who hold that, I will say, yes, when you think about the love of your neighbor, you can't afford just to think about, well, is this vaccine as effective, as safe and effective as they say it is? There's good reason to doubt that. Even at McGill right now, with the whole business, of course, of mandates, I'm saying, well, okay, but.
I think the second point you're making was beyond that, right? Even if it was effective.
Yeah.
Maybe the fear, promoting this fear for 2 years or however long it's been, and it is already an objection to is it moral to take this vaccine?
Yes, that's true. So if we regard human beings as creatures to whom we do have a moral obligation, well, I think we do to all creatures in some sense, but let's not try to solve all the problems in the world. If we regard our fellow human beings as people to whom we have a moral obligation, just as we have, and because we have a moral obligation to the Creator, then we have to consider that obligation as it affects the body for the sake of the soul, treating the good of the soul as even more important than the good of the body, and considering both together and thinking about their social and political and economic ramifications, and not only their medical ramifications. And on every one of those levels, what I'm saying is there are really serious questions that require to be answered. And the answers we're getting seem to me so much propaganda rather than really serious answers to them. So that's one reason why I was so happy to come on with you guys, because you, though this isn't your immediate territory, recognize and can put questions like this. You may answer them differently than I have in the article, or you may at least not be convinced by all the answers I've tried to give in the article, but you realize they're important, I take it. And I think they're frightfully important. And unless we think on all those levels, we're not doing the job that we ought to be doing as good neighbors.
Yeah, so maybe this comes to a point that I was going to ask later, but I think we're just, getting into the heart of it anyway. So
we're only at objection 1.
Yeah, it's going to have to be a 10-part series, which I'd be glad to do. But anyway, okay.
Maybe 6-part.
Maybe 6. I don't know. Who knows if we got to it all in one shot. So yeah, I guess the sort of this fear aspect I think is very interesting, and I guess my question is, like, if we accept, because all the stuff about why they're promoting vaccines and whether COVID is actually this level of risk or that, I think these are all falsifiable claims, and that, given enough time, we'll know which one was right or wrong, hopefully. But I was wondering, like, if we were to accept that the vaccine is going to reduce my chance of having my body harmed, and also my neighbor, even if it's by a small margin, and if the risk, adverse risk, is also low, does the act of just taking the vaccine somehow promote that fear and also cause undue harm to the soul? And does it also promote, is it also some sort of tacit act of endorsement of other harmful policies like lockdowns or what people might perceive as harmful policies?
Yeah.
Just the act of getting the injection, right? And maybe if you don't tell anyone, or like sort of that isolated sort of scenario, do you see that as being somehow inseparable, or do you see it as being like, all right, I'm going to take it and then I'm going to vote against the whatever party put all of this in place, and that should be enough?
Yeah, that's again a good question and an extremely difficult one. Let me try to say a few things in short order, and not necessarily in their most logical order. First of all, I'm more or less with Malone on the matter of the vaccines, so-called, are almost certainly helpful to some people, and there's nothing inherently wrong with a therapy that helps you, although one does have to ask questions about not only about its long-term effects, but about the nature of the intervention and the means by which the intervention is made. So you'll have noticed in this piece that I touch relatively briefly, but not insignificantly, on the question of how we derive some of these interventions from fetal cells, where we have taken or even deliberately killed little people in order to produce useful medicines. So when the Nazis did things like that, not usually with infants, or the Chinese Communist Party does it, again, not usually with infants, but with adults, we say, oh, well, that's bad. Although mostly we try to ignore that they're doing it. We don't talk about it because it's too uncomfortable. So when you ask those kinds of questions, you also have to go there. You can't just ignore that. But let's set it aside for the moment and say, in principle, there's nothing wrong with the human reason devising ways of helping people that involve new techniques. I mean, that's part of what it means to be a rational animal. Why would anyone with this worldview suggest otherwise? I don't know, and I certainly wouldn't suggest otherwise. But that, of course, only brings us back to the question of, are we helping more than we're hurting? Are we doing things that in this situation are warranted? And are we using licit means? So if I need an organ transplant and I can't get it, and I go to China where the organ is being taken coercively from a living, healthy human specimen and given to me for a price, And that is happening. And anybody who says it's not happening just is either accidentally or deliberately not paying attention. That is an illicit means. It would be better for me to die than to be party to that. So we have to ask all those kinds of questions if we want to think morally, if we want to do and live and practice things in an ethically sound and morally sound fashion. So that's the two sides of the initial answer to the question. We're not talking about a bias against technology. We're not talking about a bias against science, which helped to bring modern technology into existence, and which, by the way, was itself brought into existence in part through this kind of theological reasoning. I hope soon to post a lecture of my own on this subject that you can watch if you like. But even Alfred North Whitehead, who was no theist, admitted that in his own history of science. So it's not against science, it's not against technology, it's not against medicine. Most of the really big pioneers in these fields were people who shared this very worldview. It is always a question of asking about justice and prudence, without which one does not love effectively. And Augustine made that point very, very clearly in his work on the morals of the Catholic Church. If you're going to love your neighbor effectively, you have to love the neighbor's body, he called that medicine, for the sake of the soul, and the love of the soul he called discipline, helping the neighbor on to a truly healthy existence through the love of God and neighbor. You got to think about all of that. It's a big task. I worry in our present context that people are losing sight of the forest for the trees, because you can debate till the cows come home about what the exact death rate from COVID is. You can debate till the cows come home how much the lockdowns are costing psychologically and economically. But what I think is not really debatable is that we have taken actions that produce harm on a scale that we have not seen since some of these regimes that I've mentioned. And we have done so with a fairly flimsy excuse. And not only that, but we had the map in place before we started. Those things, it seems to me, are pretty hard to overlook once you start looking at this straight in the eye. And I'm happy to, like you said at the beginning, none of us are medical experts, and I'm happy to be corrected on this or that feature or statistic. But I'm not too bad at looking at forests. Grew up in them, and both literally and metaphorically. And I see a forest here, and I want my fellow Canadians and Americans, for that matter, and anyone else who's willing to pay any attention, to look at the big picture and not simply take their direction from what they see on the nightly news, which, even if that's all they had, you would think they would say, how is it that all of a sudden every newscaster is saying the same thing? And that when the narrative changes, it changes in lockstep for everybody. How is that happening? I mean, there's so many signs that there's something wrong here that even people without the least interest in what the heck is mRNA technology, or how do we create vaccine passes and make them work, stuff you guys would know a lot more about. Even people who don't know anything about any of that don't know what to do with it. There's enough in front of them to make them ask hard questions, even if they don't ask them as well as you're asking them.
So I guess we all agree that there's many factors for you to consider before, putting up any policy, right? You can't just consider like these, you have to consider economy, you have to consider the soul, you have to consider the body, you have to consider a bunch of different things. So do you think, a lot of your objections would not be there if the government was, let's say, more transparent with why they were making certain choices, and if they put, framed their choices in a context, or very quantitative, say, about their choices. So they framed them in the context of, once we achieve this threshold, we will remove these restrictions, or once we've achieved this, we will add this, give you back this freedom, or whatever they want to, if they're more quantitative and more precise about what they wanted to do.
Well, I would certainly be happier with them, yes.
But in terms of morality, so now we're talking about, there are things like, we have to consider a bunch of different things, a range of different aspects of what the policies are doing and what the virus is doing.
Yes, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I guess I'm repeating myself.
Well,
and it seems like the government is also saying, well, we're going to do this, and let's not tell you why, or discuss why we're doing this, or what's the reasoning behind taking these actions.
Well, it could be that the people can't be trusted, right? Like, it's probably an appeal to authority. I mean, we've had this discussion before, right? Well, can we say that we can trust citizens to make these kinds of decisions that could have societal impact? Like, where individual decisions have some kind of societal impact, do we give that trust to individuals? I don't know if that answers the question or takes it somewhere else.
So that's the flip side of that coin, obviously. But let's stay with the obverse for a moment. The notion that a government will create and sustain over now nearly 2 years a state of exception in which the local CMOH for your province tells you stay home because at the bars you catch COVID, and worse because you catch misinformation, or the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's locked her whole country down again for one case. I mean, why not just shoot the poor bastard and get on with life? I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm not being serious, as you can tell, and please forgive my language. But who said a long time ago, look, we will be your source of information. You should not listen to anyone else. You can trust us. We are your only trustworthy source of information. When you see and hear things like that, and you see the media moving in lockstep and not asking any of these kinds of questions that we've been talking about, you do have a very good reason to withhold what, even according to me and this tradition, you ought in principle and presumptively to give, which is respect for authority and, as far as possible, trust in authority. You have good reason to question your trust. And I will just say, on a purely pragmatic level, that anyone who supposes that a government that takes your constitutional rights from you and hands them back piecemeal if you do what you're told, and does so, for that matter, by putting them on the end of a stick like a carrot, in Aesop's fable, to keep the donkey moving. How many people took their shots on the assumption that it was 2, and then their freedoms came back and the crisis was over? Do they still believe that narrative? If so, I don't know what to do for them. We're talking here, as I said, long-term perpetual vaccinations where your natural immunity system is going to be replaced, as far as we can, with a humanly, artificially, I'm not against the artificial, I've said that before and I want to say it again. Artificiality is something humans can do because they're rational animals. There's nothing wrong with it. But I have deep questions about replacing a natural and naturally robust immune system with something constantly dependent on tinkering from drug companies. I don't see why I shouldn't have a question about that, especially when the drug companies are becoming filthy rich this way. And the government is saying, guess what? If you don't do it, your passport will expire. So you got your shot so you could go to, to Bermuda for, a vacation. Guess what? If you don't get the next shot, no matter what you think of the health risk to you or whether you need it or whether it's helping anybody, your passport expires and you're stuck. Okay, that's the situation we're going into. That's the political end. And again, I don't propose to know exactly what the people who are producing this system are thinking or what their next moves were when they made their first moves. I only say I can smell a rat when there's a dead rat there, and that's a rat. But using our technology to help us accomplish things is a great thing. But as you well know, any good thing can be perverted. And it seems to me we are seeing it being perverted before our eyes, and our freedoms taken from us and handed back piecemeal if we do what we're told. There's something fundamentally wrong with that.
I think, Carlos, I don't want to speak for Carlos. I think we kind of agree with that. But if we go back to this trust issue, yes, the government is telling us, or these pharmaceutical companies are telling us that we should trust them because X, Y, and Z. But don't you think we live in a world where today access to the internet, just like you were able to look up all these statistics, I can look them up, and anyone basically in Canada can look them up. So trusting, you don't have to trust the government, right, to tell you these statistics or to make these calls for you, right? We can presumably somehow come to these conclusions ourselves.
I guess there's like a lethal combination, right? Like, yes, you can check the clinical studies, you can look at the mRNA sequence and everything, but if there's also the coercion by the government, then it's a bad combination. That's my guess, right? Because it would be, what will be ideal is this, yes, there's a transparency, but also we ultimately have the final say. Because today, maybe this one, I mean, I'm personally mostly convinced that the vaccine is not very harmful, although I'm, again, not a medical expert. But, combining these two things, right? The government coercion can maybe tomorrow lead to where the vaccine is not tested or there's a mistake or something, and now you're coerced to take it, right?
Yeah, this I agree with. In this specific context, though, I can say check all the data I wanted myself and make sure the vaccine was safe.
Yeah, so this is maybe like a blockchain thing, right? Like when we, one of the sort of philosophies that people that follow blockchain is that we should remove as much trust as we possibly can from authority and from governments and from any sort of centralized unit, right? So whenever we see that, okay, they're publishing the vaccine sequence and they're publishing the results of the trials and all that, we're happy about that because we don't need to trust the authorities anymore. But then I think they take the extra step of saying, well, even though you don't have to trust us, you're going to have to do what we tell you.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that's a problem, and I also think that once you get people saying you must trust us or else, that's not a healthy situation. And if we should trust them or else in this matter, why should we not be asked to trust them that they are the right people to be making these decisions all the time? In other words, what happens to, see, you can go out and do your own study on any of these statistics and questions we've mentioned in passing and come to different conclusions. But if you start doing that, first of all, we've seen censorship take place, serious censorship, so that even people like Robert Malone, who's anything but anything but a libertarian for that matter, is censored. You can still find his stuff out there, of course, and people are interviewing him like crazy, but stuff is being taken down all the time to discourage people from doing that. Why is the next step going to be so difficult to say, look, you can't trust people like that, even though they're scientists. You must only trust the prime minister, whether it's in New Zealand or Canada or wherever. And by the way, because these are the only people you can trust, these are the only people you should elect, right? So, don't think about electing somebody different. This is now a state of exception. We can't afford the old patterns. We have to, these are the people who call the shots, and you must trust them. And at some point you can't replace them. I mean, that's how it is in China, of course. And that's the kind of concern that some of these legal scholars I mentioned are having about the evolution of Western laws, where they begin to look more and more like authority derives from those who already have it.
So I guess the point is they're forcing us to trust that they're balancing all these factors properly, right? Because the science, like you say, I can check myself, no problem. I can get these statistics, but then what do I do with these statistics, right? I have to come up with a policy that's good for everybody, and they're kind of forcing us to trust their perspective on how to balance all these factors: the soul, the body, the science, the economy, and all this stuff.
But isn't that like the definition of authority? Like what you said earlier, Professor, you should trust me or else. Sounds to me like what an authority is, right? So where do you break that link?
Yeah. So as a theologian now, if I can put my theologian's cap on or put it to the fore, I would say that the very notion that the creator deliberately and freely creates rational animals with free will, who have reason and will, wills that respond to reason and vice versa. I mean, I could take you to lots of texts that you don't have time to hear about at the moment, but that very idea says that the creator wants the human creature to be voluntarily engaged in the good. And that's the way the creator designs these creatures. You go back to that paradigmatic story in the Hebrew Bible from Genesis 3 about the fall, right? And the serpent who says, well, God doesn't want actually, God said no to this because he's afraid if you do it, you'll get better and more godlike, and he doesn't want that. And of course, the point of the story is that God precisely does want that. It's the serpent lying about God and the nature of God's authority, as if God's authority were arbitrary. You do what I say, you don't do what I say not to do, and that's that. That's the serpent's caricature of true authority. And when you then think down the ladder, so to say, to angelic authority or human authority, or authority in the family, never mind the state, etc. By the way, Augustine already thinks on all those levels in The City of God, a book I read with my undergraduates even.
Tried to read that and I didn't get very far.
You get a vision of authority that seeks good, and because it seeks good, it seeks people to be good. And because it seeks people to be good, it does not simply impose on them arbitrarily, but invites them. I'd like to see a few signs that our government really invites you to do what you're talking about, and that it invites Robert Malone to do it or Douglas Farrow to do it. There's not afraid of any of that. So never mind the mRNA vaccines. What about masks? Read any of the studies on masks? Clearly manipulative devices.
We actually have a podcast, a similar discussion.
Sorry, I will watch it.
Yeah.
Oh, you can if you want to.
but I mean, it seems that there's a fair bit of evidence that the government was intent on the beginning from shaping people's opinion through manipulative techniques and through censorship. I'm not afraid to say that. I don't think, whatever one says about a particular element of it, or the reason for using that element at that time. There's a clear pattern here, and I'm not a libertarian, but I do think that people like you should be, and me should be, and libertarians too for that matter, should be absolutely at liberty to get on with this kind of questioning. I think it's at the core of science. I think it's at the core of good technological developments. I think it's also at the core of how we apply our science and our technology, and not just our political science, all our science. And what I see going on in the world of political science really worries me as actually being a subversion of that whole attitude and approach to life that I think most of us still prize.
I think maybe maybe there's a sort of fear or like sense of expedience that, you know, we're facing a crisis, and if we just, you know, sit back and question everything for, you know, weeks, we're just gonna all sort of, you know, miss our chance to act. And so we need some sort of consensus to say, all right, we're not going to question this, we're going to go for it. And because, you know, if we do question, we might end up losing whatever battle it is we're fighting, right? So maybe it is better to go down questioning than to sort of run into your own death sort of confidently. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but back to 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I mean, that was not a clever phrase that somebody thought up that just got caught on. That was the message.
Yeah.
Okay, we're 2 years now. Who believes people who said stuff like that? Why would you?
Yeah, it seems like this, like, trust us or else is like, trust us or else you get censored or something, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Well, I mean, you can say, again, maybe being devil's advocate here, nobody can predict what the virus is going to be doing, you know, in the next 6 months.
Point, yeah.
So
Indeed, but
yeah, there should be a breaking point that somewhere, I guess.
Well, yes, but also, I mean, as you will know, I expect, you know, some serious scientists who are unafraid to speak up, and some serious medical scientists and doctors who are unafraid to speak up. That's another thing that, you know, again, I mean, one just hears so many stories of people who are afraid to speak up, and some of them you hear privately because they won't speak up, but they will tell you if you ask them. But anyways, are saying, look, we told you from the beginning what we already knew long before the coronavirus crisis. Programs of mass vaccination against coronaviruses do more harm than good, and they create these much more powerful variants than you normally see, and that's why we gave up on them the previous times. So when
how do you mean that they create more variants?
Well, because they don't work like your normal immune system. They are specifically targeted responses to specific features of the viral opponent, and they therefore create an easier path for the mutation to get around that particular defense you set up. All right. We know about these things in our ordinary lives from, I mean, I don't profess to understand the details of the science, but I have read and listened to some very serious scientists who make exactly that point. When you start mass vaccinating people who are not at risk of a coronavirus, you give openings to the virus to mutate into more dangerous forms. That's their claim. Now, we're not far enough along with that process to know, but for certain that it will happen here or is happening here, because even with Delta, the kill rate is very, very low at present, very low, as you would expect from a mutant. But their anxiety, curiously, about what mutations that are based on mass vaccinations of people who are not actually at risk, that they're concerned that will create more serious variants, interestingly coincides with some of the fear apparatus in the media and in the government saying, oh yeah, you know, we thought we were out of the woods and so we gave you a break this summer, but boy, it's Delta time now. I heard a story from, I mustn't tell tales out of school, especially not on the internet, but I heard a story from a friend whose grandson some months ago was told by his mother that you know, they were going to make, you know, when they went into the store, they were going to make them do this and that and the other thing. So this young lad gets in the store with her and he goes prowling around the aisle saying, it's COVID time, people. But you see, we're getting that again and again and again. We're getting it with Delta, we'll get it with Lambda, et cetera, because there are people who want to work that angle. But there's a serious, not only is that a serious problem, there's also the potential problem, which science has known about from before COVID, that certain attempts to squash coronaviruses can make the situation worse. Now, I'm not going to go to the, you know, to try to describe how that is. I have some layman's idea of it, but all I can tell you is that some of the most serious virologists have been making that claim. Montagnier, for example, you know, the discoverer of AIDS. He said right along, don't do this. This is going to be a problem. It's interesting to watch this situation unfold, but frankly, it's getting quite desperate, because whether or not it gets desperate medically, and I don't think it has, and I'm very hopeful still that it won't, it is getting desperate politically, economically, psychologically. And so I'll come full circle to that remark about fear that got me into it when I got a phone call from a very capable intellectual in Manhattan saying, you know, you got to look at this because I've never seen anything like it. That was during 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Well, if it had been 2 weeks to flatten the curve and that had all gone away, instead of being pumped up and amped up by every, you know, media outlet and every government official for 2 years, well, I would have said, okay, well, listen, I was busy before. Now, what was I doing? You distracted me. But instead, I'm saying, yeah, as I've looked at this unfold for the last almost 2 years, well, year and a half, I'm appalled at what I'm seeing. And I'm appalled about leaders who want people to live in fear. And frankly, I will say this online, I'm appalled by some of my colleagues' attitudes at my university, who think nothing of putting young people who are not at risk at this virus from being at risk, both from the vaccines and from political constraints that once in place, and once the powers to impose them are established by this precedent, they will not probably get back. In order to prevent themselves from being exposed to somebody who transmits this and who haven't even paid enough attention to know that fully vaccinated people also transmit. In Canada, by the way, the most recent, now these are a couple of weeks old, but, and it's not very convincing because the sample sizes are so disparate, but more vaccinated people were suffering serious effects than unvaccinated people. I say I'm not standing by that because this data is, the set of vaccinated people suffering is so much smaller than the set of data we had to work with before, and it's evolving all the time. And I don't know where it is at just exactly as we speak. But Israel has seen and provided much evidence that it is simply not the case that vaccinated people are not at risk. And these people know that, at least to this extent, that they know that even though they're vaccinated, they can't trust their vaccinations to save them. And that's why they don't want the unvaccinated people near them. What they're ignoring is simply that the vaccinated people who are near them can also transmit to them. But anyways, it's difficult for any one of us to keep fully up with this. But let me ask you something. Do you think your premier or your chief medical health officer or your prime minister or your minister of health is keeping up with all these things? And what else do they do for a living? I mean, I've found it difficult to keep up with these things myself. And of course, I'm not being advised all the time as they are, but are they being advised by a balanced team of people, or are they being advised by the same people who tell the media what to say, which is all one-sided, bang, 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 hammer, hammer, hammer all the time? So, I think, again, we have reason not to be suspicious of technology, not to be suspicious of government and authority as such, but to be suspicious, yes, of this technology because its own creators are suspicious of it, and to be suspicious of these governments who have acted in such a way as to, yes, forfeit the trust that ordinarily they would be owed.
I think that's a pretty good place to hold it for now, since we've hit the 2-hour mark. I don't know what you think.
That seems appropriate to me. Perry, what do you think?
I'm okay with that as well. I think there's a lot here to unravel. I think.
Well, we did one objection, Perry. So.
yeah,
absolutely. But I think we touched on most of them, though. I think.
Yeah.
At least glancing touches on most of the objections. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. To think about.
Very good. Well, if we want to go at it again, as long as the authorities let us, I'm game.
I'll be very happy to. Thank you.
Yeah, we were happy to hear that, I think.
And thanks so much for your good questions. I haven't always given great answers, but I'm glad if you've found some things worth pondering.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
I found I might want to talk more about the Catholic interpretation of authority. I hadn't thought about that earlier, but it's pretty interesting. Maybe we can discuss that later on.
Sure, and let me just say that some of the existing Catholic authorities were not happy with that article. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as they say.
Actually, I was curious about one thing. The article you published, this one on the Catholic World Report. Is this like a peer-reviewed article? Is it just an editor reads it and posts it, or? So
things that, in that respect, that operate a certain way in the so-called hard sciences, and even in some spheres of social science, tend to operate a little differently with media organs of that sort. That is, they have built-in advising processes, but they're not like double-blind reviews. And as I pointed out to an editor just recently, in a sort of a more academic journal that I had given a paper to, quite a bit longer paper than this. Engaging with Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher. It's pretty hard to blind review an article that makes a reference in more than one place to a book that you've written. And he wrote back and said, "Don't worry about the book you've written. Everybody knows your style." So yeah, you're right. The blind review can't be fully blind. But the short answer to your question is, Catholic World Report is an interesting place because it runs a lot of the kind of popular stuff that, the question of review doesn't enter into it. But it also runs feature essays. I think the longest I produced for them is about 12,000 words. And for those, its internal advisory processes, play in, but these are unusual to us in the academic world. That is, they're not merely popular, they're not purely academic, and their processes are tailored to their own needs and intentions. So no, I mean, this article we're working with is a philosophical and theological argument, or article that makes arguments on a number of different levels. And it's, of course, an invitation to the reader to think hard and make his or her own judgments. I would like to think that if a couple of theologians or other experts in other fields were to review it, they would say, like you said, this is worth reading and thinking about, even if it annoys me. And by the way, Farrow's bishop or something. So.
All right, yeah, thanks. I was not aware of how it worked actually, and it's good to.
Well, I think, Perry, you've had that kind of situation in your very small subfield of condensed matter physics, right?
Yes,
where
but it's always
blind review knows who it is.
But it's still peer reviewed, right? It's still blind.
Yeah, for sure.
That's good. It's all up here, Perry.
I've come across that too. Yeah. Okay, well, we should probably get to dinner or whatever we had planned. Don't want to keep you much longer. Thank you so much, Professor, and we will hopefully see you soon again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
All the best to both of you with your respective challenges.
Thank you. Likewise.
Likewise.